right, everybody ready and eager to jump into one of the most interesting, intriguing stories in the Kings. From here on out then, the Ahab story is fascinating. It really is something like days of your lives. It's like these relationships are going to start intertwining, and eventually we're going to end up with a man from Judah reigning over Israel and a woman from Israel reigning over Judah. So this is really going to be such a turnaround event. It's, for me, one of the most interesting stories out of the book of Kings. And then also we're going to see in this man Ahab, a man who has completely fallen away from God. In all of his dealings, it says there was never a man like Ahab who purposefully gave himself to doing evil. And yet towards the end, he's going to cry out for grace from God, and God's going to give him grace. It's really, it's a beautiful story. Sad, because he causes so much destruction and tastes so much destruction in himself, but just the grace of God poured out. So Ahab marries Jezebel, and the scripture says, together with all his badness, he added to it this. So it was clearly a very, very evil decision to make. All right, God does not look on that lightly, because Ethbaal is her dad, and he's a Sidonian king and high priest. It's sort of like the Queen of England, who's the head of the Church of England. That's his role as king. He's also the high priest. And she then comes to the Israelite kingdom with the goal of establishing Baal worship in this land. It clearly is her goal. She's going to bring the Sidonian religion as the state religion of Israel. And in doing that, she purposefully kills out the prophets and servants of God. Anybody as a known child of the living God is killed. Really rough. And she starts establishing priests from any tribe that want to become a priest for Baal. And so they become hundreds and eventually thousands all over the land. She's actually feeding these priests as well. So it's from the state coffers, she pays them a salary to further Baal worship. So it's really full on, very dedicated to this. At this very dark time then, take notice, God sends a mighty miracle-working prophet. What's happening here? Up until this time, the prophets have actually come from the south, speaking to the kings in the north. Now God is bringing a man staying in the north, demonstrating the power and the light and the goodness of God in the darkest of times. It starts off with Elijah making a declaration. That's where we meet him. He says, "It will not rain in the land until I say so." The book of James quotes it and says, Elijah was a man like us, and he prayed and it did not rain for 3.5 years. Now, part of the problem is he's not from Judah. He's staying up there. So he himself is going to suffer the famine. And when it became hard, God said to him, go to the Kiriath ravine, there on the other side of the Jordan River. And there he found a constant flowing stream, and he lived next to this ravine. And God sent every day crows carrying food in their mouth to sustain him. And then after some time over there, this ravine ran dry. And God said to him, go up to Zarephath. Now, Zarephath, that's way up between Sidon and Tyre. It's out of the borders of the country. Later we're going to hear part of the reason might have been because Ahab is hunting him down. He's looking for this man who said it will not rain. And he cannot find him because now he's outside the borders of the country. Interesting, very close to his wife's hometown, Sidon. And when he arrived over there, the question is, how's God going to supply for him? And it sounds like this drought is all the way up there as well. They are also suffering from it, because he meets a widow as he comes into this town, and he says to the widow, please, give me some food to eat. And she says, I don't have anything. In fact, the little bit of dough that I have left, I'm about to go home now and make me and my son's last meal. And then we will die. And Elijah's reply is, nevertheless, make me one first. And this woman must have had faith, or she's just a really self-sacrificing person, because she does make him a meal and then made her son a meal. And it never ended until the end of the famine. That maize kept coming out, kept coming out, kept coming out, and they ate from that as long as Elijah was there. After 3.5 years then, he returns back to Israel, and he bumps into a man, Obadiah, who is the palace administrator for Ahab. And Obadiah, remember, he's not the prophet Obadiah that we've got the book from. Obadiah is a man of God. He loves God. How he did that while he was in the palace blows my mind. But he went further than that. Obadiah was hiding 200 servants of God in a cave and feeding them every day, keeping them alive. He was living a very, very dangerous life. So he bumps into Elijah there in the field, and Elijah says to him, go and call Ahab, I need to speak to him. And he says, are you crazy? When I leave here, the Spirit of God's going to take you somewhere else, and when I come back with Ahab, having said, you are here and you're not, he's going to kill me, because he's been looking for you all over. At that very moment, Obadiah and Ahab actually split up to try and look for some patch of grass somewhere so that the royal palace's horses can maybe find a place to feed. That's how desperate things are in the country. And so he promises me, I will be here when Ahab comes. And when Ahab comes, his welcoming call to Elijah is, hello, you troubler of Israel. To which Elijah replies, no, you are causing trouble for Israel, because you and your wife are drawing their hearts away from God. All of this trouble is your doing. And then he says to him, get together all the Baal prophets in the land and meet me on Mount Carmel, there at the coast. And we're going to see who is the true God. And here comes the famous contest on Mount Carmel. And so with hundreds of Baal prophets there and also Asherah prophets there, there's one man of God representing the true God, Elijah. And the nation is gathered to come and look at this contest. Who's going to be the true God? And Elijah lays down the rules. He says, you guys build an altar over there to your God. I'm going to build an altar over here to my God. We're going to put a sacrifice on top of the altar, and we're going to see whose God will answer with fire from heaven to light his own sacrifice. And so he gives these guys the whole day to dance around their altar, and later on they become desperate, and they take stones and broken pots, and they start cutting themselves to draw their God's attention, and they shout out and chant the whole day long around the altar. At some stage, Elijah jeers them. In one of the translations, it sounds like he says, call a bit louder. Maybe he's in the bathroom. In one of the translations, it sounds like, call a bit louder. Maybe he's on holiday somewhere. And nothing happens. And then he stops them towards the end of the day and he says, all right, you had your go. It's mine now. And he prepares the altar, built out of uncut stones, nothing elaborate, nothing fancy. That's the way that God says it needs to be done. And he puts the wood on the altar and the sacrifice, and then he digs the ditch around the altar. It's close to the coast. I don't know if they found the water there, But he says, come, bring water. And they chuck out a whole bunch of liters of water over this thing, soaking it until everything is soaking wet and there's water standing in the ditch around it. You want it to be absolutely clear that everybody knows this is not my doing if fire comes. And then in a simple one-sentence prayer, he bows down and he says, God, show yourself to be the true God. And fire comes down from heaven. Such a fierce fire that it burns the sacrifice, burns the wood, licks up the water, and it burns the stones from which the altar is made to ashes. And everybody fell down and worshiped God. And then the opposite thing happened. They took those Baal prophets that had been leading them astray for all those years, and they had a massacre, killing hundreds of them. And then it was time to turn the tide around. These people are suffering. So Elijah went one side and prayed and asked God, please God, send rain. And he sent his servant and says, go on top of the hill and see if there's any clouds. He comes back, he says, there's nothing. He says, please God, break the drought. Eventually, God comes back and says, there's a cloud as big as a man's fist over there. And Elijah then said to Ahab, you better get home to Jezreel fast. The rain is coming. What a statement of faith to make. There's no rain clouds. It's a cloud as big as a fist. And on that he knows God is answering my prayer. And Elijah runs behind the chariot of Ahab all the way to Jezreel, so fast that he eventually overtakes the chariot, and the rain starts bucketing down before they reach the city. And after this incredible victorious day, we then get a real slap. Because Jezebel heard that Elijah had the prophets killed, her prophets, her people. And so she sends a message to Elijah and says, your head will be like those of the Baal priests that you have killed. I'm coming to kill you. And with that, he flees the country. For 40 days, he travels all the way down to Mount Sinai, where God spoke to Moses. And along the way, God sends angels to minister to him, and to strengthen him, and to give him food. And when he reaches Mount Sinai, he cries out to God, because God says, Elijah, what are you doing here? Isn't it an interesting question? It sounds like God said, why are you running? Eh? I sent fire from heaven. I can sort her out. It's all right. I've got your back. I've been feeding you for 3.5 years, looking after you. But the man is really, really struck. There's so many books actually written about this particular event, just speaking about soul care, about ministering and standing in a place where you honor God and where you really need to look out, because tiredness is a real thing and fear can easily grab you in a moment like that. But here he is on the mountain, and God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he says, God, don't you know? Jezebel wants to kill me. And then he cries out to God and he says, and I'm alone in Israel, serving you and honoring you. And God says, no, you're not. I've preserved 2,000 servants of mine who have not bowed the knee to Baal once. You think you're alone. You're not alone. There are others like you who are faithful to me. And then it says there was this big storm, but God did not speak in the storm. And there was hail and things coming, and God wasn't in that. And there was a quiet wind, and God spoke to him in such a peaceful way. And then the message that comes through is, don't worry, Elijah. Things are about to change. God tells him 3 very specific things that's going to happen. And 3 things that he needs to go and do. And every one of these things are sort of like a shaker. It's like, what? How is this going to happen? How on earth is this going to take place? The first of them is, he says, go and anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Now there on the right-hand side on the previous page, you would have seen we brought Ben-Hadad in. And Ben-Hadad is for some time now going to be part of the stories because there's a lot of war between the Arameans and the Israelites around this time. And Hazael is the court official of Ben-Hadad. So immediately, Elijah would have heard, well, how's that going to happen? How's the court official going to become king? Surely Ben-Hadad's son must become king. Okay, it means Ben-Hadad's going to have to be killed. What's going to happen? This is going to be a real shaker because they are the powerful nation in the world at the moment. It's sort of like us saying the president of America is going to be assassinated. Ooh, the whole world's going to shake. What's going to happen? Next thing is, God says, and go and anoint Jehu as king over Israel. Who's king over Israel at the moment? Ahab. Who's going to be the next king of Israel? That's not going to happen just yet. Ahab. Oh, we've got Ahab. There we go. He's on this side. Peter. He's the horrible one, yeah. Pin him up to one of these pegs over here. Now, Jehu is the son of Jehoshaphat, who is the king of Judah. How's that going to happen? Why go and anoint the prince of the south to be king of the north? That's a complete turnaround. Things are truly about to change. And Jehoshaphat is a very godly man. As evil as Ahab is, so godly is Jehoshaphat. There's a drastic change about to come. And then he says, go and anoint Elisha as your successor. And in every one of these, it would clearly have told Elijah, listen, have faith. Things are about to change. It's not going to go on the way it is now. Things are about to change. But it required a heck of a lot of faith from this man to hear it and believe it and say, all right, I don't know how any of that's going to happen. And so he leaves there and he goes back home and he does the one thing. He goes and anoints Elisha as his successor. And Elisha is busy plowing a field, and he must have been a pretty strong guy. He had 2 of these oxen himself driving. And sounds like they had a pretty big farm because it says there were 12 oxen working the field at that time. That's a big farm. Right? It's a wealthy farm. And as he came there into the field, Elijah just poured oil over Elisha's head. And immediately Elisha knew what just happened. He says, wait, just wait here and let me just go and greet my father and my mother, and then I will follow you. And Elijah says, well, what have I done to you? And he walks off. He says, I didn't ask you to follow me. I've done what I needed to do. But here's Elisha's response, which I think is such a beautiful teaching for us. He takes those 2 oxen and he slaughters them right there on the spot. And he takes the plow equipment that he's just been using, he cuts it up, and he makes a fire, and he braais. And he feeds it to the people, have a massive feast. I mean, that's 2 oxen. The whole farm is eating, celebrating. And what is he saying in the process? He says, I'm done with this. I'm not going to plow here again. I'm leaving the farm. And it's a lot to leave. I think those 12 oxen picture is really important for us to see. It's a big business that he's leaving, a profitable farm, it seems. And from that day on, he becomes Elijah's handmaiden, right? He's serving him, washing his hands, making his food, all of those kind of things. It's nothing glorious in that. Traveling around wherever Elijah is, he is. But Elijah never did any of the other 2 things that God told him. It's going to get done in time, but if I read it right, it sounded like it needed to happen there. God clearly tells him, just like he told him, anoint your successor, go and anoint these guys. Go and change the kingdoms. Well, there's a couple of stories then about Ben-Hadad that jumps out. And one of them, there's an encounter in war, and God gives the Israelites victory. And he captures Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram. And God sends a prophet, and this prophet stands along the road where he knows that Ahab's going to pass by. And he says to one of the men passing by, he says, listen, give me a blow on the cheek. Hit me. And the guy says, no, I'm not going to do it. And he actually calls a curse on the guy. The next guy comes around and he says, hit me on the cheek. And the guy does it. Poof. And now he sits with his wound, and he takes a bandage and he puts it around. And then Ahab comes along in his chariot. And Ahab captured Ben-Hadad and then let him go. And here's the prophetic word. He says, you have set free a man I had determined should die. Therefore it is your life for his life, your people for his people. God gave him victory in the battle, but he never asked God, what should I do? I've got their king. And he just assumed and showed grace and let him go. And you're going to see just now the repercussions of what he did. If Ben-Hadad died at that moment, things would have looked very different for Israel in the couple of years that's going to follow. And then the famous story of Naboth's vineyard. Ahab looked out from his palace and he saw a field close by that belonged to a guy called Naboth. And he said, that's a very convenient spot. Right there, that vineyard could be my vegetable patch. And so he went off to Naboth and he offered him money. He said, listen, can I give you some money, or can I give you any other piece of ground that I have in exchange for this field? And Naboth says, not a chance. I dare not do that. This is family ground. I cannot let it go out of the family, no matter what you give me. And Ahab goes back home like a little boy sulking. I didn't get what I want. And Jezebel comes around in the palace and notices, hey, he's got a bad attitude. What's bothering you, my husband? Well, Naboth doesn't want to sell me his field. And she just says, well, leave it to me. I'll sort it out. And here, for the first time, we see into the character of this woman. So when for the rest of the scripture it speaks about the Jezebel spirit in the book of Revelation, that Jezebel, this is the picture that comes to mind. Not just the one of full-on Baal worship, but the conniving little woman that she was. So she says, declare a fast day. And then invite Naboth to the fast meal as well, to break the fast. And then as they sat around the table, she organized 2 scoundrels to stand up and to bring false accusations against Nadab. It says, he cursed God and he cursed the king. And both of those, well, you've got to die. You've got to be killed. I'm assuming she means Baal being the god, because I don't think she wanted anything else to do with the true God. And there they are at the meal, and these 2 scoundrels speak up and they tell these lies, and Naboth is killed. And then she goes back home and says to Ahab, there you go, job done. Go and take the field. And he does. And God sends a prophet to him and says, listen, I will consume your descendants and cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel. Dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. And it's at this moment then that it says, there was never anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel his wife. He behaved in the vilest manner by going after idols like the Amorites the Lord drove out before Israel. When Ahab heard these words, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted. He lay in sackcloth and went around meekly. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in this day, but I will bring it on his house in the days of his son. In other words, justice will come. But this man has humbled himself and asked for forgiveness. I will have grace on him. I sort of want to read that and says, but God, that's not fair. Have you seen what he did? Have you seen how he's been? He doesn't deserve grace. And at that very phrase, I hear God's Spirit and say, well, do you? Thank you for being a gracious God. Eh? How incredible. Suffer for it. But what if his children would turn to God like this? They would enjoy grace. Yeah. So every generation has that choice. Yeah. We're going to see another story like this, sort of to the nth degree later. Then the last one there on that page, on page 24. How Ahab died. Now, there was a war with 3 years later with Aram, and this is then still with Ben-Hadad on the throne. And just consider that 3 years later, after he captured this man and graciously released this man decides, well, it's time to make war with you again. He's not returning the favor. And we're going to see Ben-Hadad will do that every time. Every single time. No matter how much grace he's shown, he just comes in, okay, it's time for war again. All right? He just considers that part of how things must work. And so in this war then, Ahab asks Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, please, will you come with me and fight against the Arameans? And Jehoshaphat says, yes, I will be with you. My army is like your army. So yes, let's join forces. Here comes Jehoshaphat. And so before they went into battle, they decided, well, let's get some prophets and just inquire of the Lord. And 400 Baal prophets came and inquired of the Lord. I said, are we going to win this battle? Are we going to be successful? Should we go? Should we not go? Is this going to be disastrous or is it going to be victorious? And every one of these 400 said exactly the same thing. In fact, one of them, Zedekiah, the picture over there, said, coming with bronze horns that he made, he says, with these horns you will drive the Arameans into pieces. And every one of the other prophets says, yes, that's what's going to happen. Success, success, success. And at this point, Jehoshaphat speaks up because he knows the voice of God. And he says, is there not a prophet of the Lord who we can inquire of? And Ahab says, yeah, there is one. But he never says anything good about me. Remember in the book of Timothy, when Paul says to Timothy, in the latter days, there will be people who will gather preachers and teachers around themselves that will say exactly what they want to hear, that will tickle their ears. Well, it's been like that then, all right? And Jehoshaphat said, no, you, my Lord, you shouldn't say that. Let's just get him and inquire of him as well. Now, you've heard from 400 guys already, you know. He says, all right, send, go and get him. And the messenger that comes to Micaiah says to him, listen, this and this is what the other guy said. So please, man, just follow suit, all right? Everybody's so excited about this war. Don't now come and ruin it. And he says, I can only say what the Lord told me to say. That's how it works. And so he comes in, and Ahab says, listen, this is what the other prophets have said. Inquire of the Lord. What does the Lord say about this battle? And he says, you will be successful. Go into the battle, you're going to win. And Ahab says, have I not made you swear before that you will only tell me what the Lord says? How interesting. He's got conviction in his heart, man. This guy knows. He knows. I'm listening to lies, but I want the lies. I want to believe the lies, and so I'll follow the lies. And when a lie like that is spoken, he knows it for what it is. And so Micaiah says, I saw the Lord sitting in a council. And the Lord asked, who will I send to bring destruction on Ahab? And so this one said that, and that one said that. And one spoke up and he says, I will go. And the Lord asked, how will you do it? He said, I will go and be a lying spirit in the mouths of all of his prophets. And the Lord said, you will be successful. Eh? And at that, Zedekiah steps forward, the guy with the iron horns, and he slaps Micaiah in the face. He says, where did the Spirit of the Lord turn away from me to come to you? And Micaiah replies, you will know on a day that you lock yourself in an inner room to hide. And that's one of those prophetic words that we actually never get the fulfillment of. We don't know how this happened. Maybe it happened when they actually lost the war and they came back. I don't know. But it surely happened. And then Ahab says, take Micaiah, lock him up in prison, and only feed him on bread and water until I come back from this battle successfully. And as he's taken away, Micaiah says, if you come back successfully and alive from this battle, then the Lord have not spoken through me. And off he goes to prison, and off they go to war. And during that war then, Ahab says to Jehoshaphat, listen, you go into the battle with your full royal attire, but I'm going into the battle in disguise. And so they went into the battle, him and his chariot and Jehoshaphat in his. And with him with full armor on, it says, and one man shot an arrow just by chance, not aiming at nobody or nothing. And it struck Ahab right in the gap between his armor in the ribs. And he bled to death in his chariot. And they took his chariot, and interestingly, they washed the chariot at a place where the prostitute washed themselves in the water. And the dogs came and drank his blood. Sort of like, very much like the prophetic word spoken earlier. And that's the end of Ahab and the end of 1 Kings.